Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something quite fundamental, looking closely at modern mental health treatment. Our focus is Terry Ridge's latest Substack essay. It's certainly stirred things up. It's called Psychiatry's Dilemma: Why Do We Treat Pain Without Hearing the Soul? And if you've been following the chatter around this, you'll know it's pretty intense. There's one perspective strongly defending the scientific rigor we've built up. You know, the argument that we absolutely have to stick to measurables, biological facts, and that bringing in ideas like soul or meaning, well, that's maybe drifting into unscientific, metaphorical territory. Dangerous, even.
Mm-hmm. Prioritizing the biomedical model, the clinical, the pragmatic.
Exactly. But then Rich comes along and insists that this very model, even though it works on symptoms, is like working from a blueprint that's missing huge pieces, fatally incomplete, he says.
And that incomplete blueprint, that's really what we need to dissect today. That's the mission for this deep dive, for you listening. We want to take Ridge's critique apart, piece by piece. The core dilemma he's pointing at isn't really about whether modern psychiatry fails to treat the pain, using medication, CBT, things with evidence behind them.
Right, he's not denying those tools work on some level.
No, not at all. It's that the map, the whole conceptual framework being used to figure out where the problem lies, is missing, let's say, 3 key dimensions. It systematically ignores the context of meaning in someone's life, their emotional bonds, their existential purpose, what he maybe poetically calls the soul or essence. So you end up brilliantly fixing an electrical short circuit, maybe, but you're completely ignoring the fact that the house's foundation is actually crumbling underneath. And this forces a kind of clash, doesn't it, between this very strict sort of isolated materialism on one side and what Ridge seems to be calling for, which is a more integral, maybe scientifically expanded vision.
Which brings us right to the heart of it, I think, for everyone listening. Whether you're involved as a patient, a practitioner, or maybe you're just trying to understand suffering better, is this dilemma Ridge describes real? Or is it, as some critics say, just sort of poetic language that makes medicine uncomfortable for good reason? And if the model is incomplete, how do we even show that? More importantly, how could we possibly fix it without, losing our scientific grounding?
Big questions.
Huge. Let's start unpacking the evidence he presents.
Okay, so Ridge's core idea, his thesis, it's actually quite simple on the surface, but it really challenges the status quo. He's arguing the problem isn't the specific treatments themselves lacking effectiveness.
Right.
It's the underlying conceptual framework, the map that guides how we use those treatments. Think of it like this, maybe. Imagine you treat a broken bone perfectly. Set it, cast it, looks great.
Okay.
But the patient immediately breaks it again. Why? Because they have this underlying, say, calcium deficiency or some bone disease that was never diagnosed.
So the local fix worked.
Exactly. The local treatment was a success. But the overall map of that person's health, the bigger picture, was incomplete. You missed a systemic issue.
And to really drive this home, he uses that powerful architectural metaphor. I found this really stuck with me.
Oh yeah, the blueprint one. It's very effective.
It is. He asks us to picture an architect designing this amazing state-of-the-art skyscraper. The plans are incredibly detailed. Every wire, every air duct, every single pipe, it's all mapped out perfectly.
Down to the millimeter.
Right. But what's completely fundamentally missing from these otherwise brilliant plans?
The foundation.
Right.
And not just the concrete, but the soil it sits on, its relationship to the land around it, the climate, whether it's in an earthquake zone. None of that's on the electrical diagram. The map is just this complex technical drawing of the internal systems, almost as if the building just floats in space.
Yeah, disconnected.
Totally disconnected. And Ridge argues modern psychiatry does something similar. It obsesses over that electrical wiring, the neurotransmitters, brain circuits, the biology you can quantify, but it systematically ignores the foundation. And in the human sense, that foundation includes the living, feeling body, our whole emotional history, our connections, our search for meaning. That's the terrain.
This is what he calls the incomplete map idea, or his Manifesto of the Third Vision.
Yes, exactly. The biomedical model, he argues, it's guilty of only showing those bits you can easily measure, the functional wiring, while ignoring the essential, maybe invisible terrain beneath. Things like the emotional mountains and spiritual abysses that actually shape a life. And as he says, an explorer can't navigate safely with a map that only shows the rivers but leaves out the mountains and forests. That's where you actually run into trouble.
Right.
And this isn't a new problem, according to Ridge. He traces its roots way back, centuries actually, to what he calls the Cartesian inheritance.
Okay, Descartes, mind-body split. For listeners maybe not familiar, can you recap that quickly?
Sure. René Descartes, the philosopher, he really formalized this idea of dualism, that the mind and the body are two completely separate things, separate substances. And this, over time, led science down a path where the mind was seen as this distinct neural machine, just kind of housed inside the skull, separate from the messy reality of the body, our feelings, our personal stories.
Like a ghost in the machine.
Precisely. And modern psychiatry, Ridge argues, inherited this sort of operating system. Focus on the hardware of the brain, focus on its processes, the chemistry, and basically ignore or downplay the conscious feeling self, the ghost.
Okay, I get the historical context, that's useful, but I need to push back a bit here, playing devil's advocate maybe. Philosophy is one thing, right? But medicine has to be grounded in data, in evidence. Why can't we just say, okay, interesting history, but that's outdated thinking? Ridge claims his critique is grounded in hard neuroscience, specifically pointing to Antonio Damásio. How does Damásio provide the clinical proof that this Cartesian split idea is just wrong?
Yeah, and that's the crucial pivot, isn't it? Damásio wasn't just philosophizing. He's a neuroscientist, and he provided really solid, repeatable evidence showing that emotion and reason are just inseparable.
Yeah.
He studied patients who had damage to very specific brain areas, the ones connecting the emotional centers, like the limbic system, to the decision-making parts, the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
And these patients, fascinatingly, they had normal intelligence, their memory was fine, their logic skills were intact. The neural machine, technically, seemed perfectly okay. But they were completely paralyzed when it came to making even the simplest decisions, like what clothes to wear or what to eat for lunch. Their ability to reason was there, but their ability to feel the significance, the implications of those choices, that was gone.
Wow. So they could crunch the numbers, so to speak, but they couldn't assign any value to the outcome.
Exactly. And this is what leads to that really critical phrase Ridge pulls out from Damásio. Emotion is integral to the processes of reason. And the key word there is integral.
Not just related, but essential.
Essential. It's not just that feelings matter somehow. It's that our very ability to make sensible decisions, to reason effectively, even to construct consciousness itself, it emerges from this seamless integration of body, emotion, and thought. So if the mind really is the body, thinking, feeling, and looking for meaning, then trying to treat just the chemical part in isolation, well, it's like trying to fix a software bug when the whole computer is plugged into a faulty, unstable power outlet. You're missing the fundamental context.
Okay, so this helps distinguish between the wiring and the foundation. Ridge uses Damásio, you said, to make a really important distinction between raw emotion and more complex feeling. Can you break that down for us? Because that seems key.
Absolutely. It's a vital distinction. The brain's electrical wiring, in this metaphor, that corresponds to raw emotion. Think of these as the body's automatic biological responses, like an alarm system.
Like heart rate, adrenaline.
Yeah, exactly. Heart rate spikes, cortisol floods your system, adrenaline surges. These are physical, measurable reactions. That's emotion. But these raw signals, these alarms, they only become meaningful because they're anchored in the foundation, which is the living body generating feeling. Feeling is the subjective, conscious, mental experience of those raw emotions.
Ah, okay.
So if a lion suddenly roars nearby, the emotion is the physical alarm going off in your body. The feeling is the subjective experience of terror, the mental story you tell yourself about the danger, the meaning you attach to it.
Got it.
And the traditional biomedical model, Ridge argues, focuses on fixing the wiring, trying to silence the alarm bell, maybe with medication, but it ignores the actual structure, the house itself, and the shifting ground underneath, which is the subjective experience, the life story, the meaning that's generating the terror in the first place.
So we're effectively medicating the alarm bell.
Without really analyzing the fire that set it off.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at the defense of the current system. This is where I think a lot of the skepticism towards Ridge's ideas comes from. The counter-argument is pretty direct, isn't it?
It is.
It basically says, look, mental health issues are, at their core, neurochemical. If we can successfully adjust serotonin levels or dopamine or whatever it is, then we are doing good science, we're being effective. And concepts like meaning or spirituality, detractors would say these are important maybe for philosophy or for a therapist chat, but they don't belong in a rigorous clinical protocol. They're just too fuzzy, too unscientific.
Right, and this is a really critical point that Ridge tackles directly. He absolutely anticipates this pushback. He knows that for many in medicine, the word spiritual is like an immediate red flag.
Yeah, it sounds like religion or mysticism entering the clinic.
Exactly. It conjures up images of, vague New Age ideas or something non-secular creeping in. But Ridge is very explicit in clarifying that the spiritual dimension, as he uses it in this clinical integrated context, has really nothing to do with metaphysics in that religious sense.
Okay, so how does he define it then, to avoid that confusion?
He defines it as the inner field where human coherence or incoherence resides. It encompasses that whole internal landscape, our unresolved traumas, desires, virtues, and emotional conflicts shaping human feeling.
So it's the internal terrain the architect ignored.
Precisely. It's the sum total of our subjective existence, the inner world, that dictates how we interpret and experience our biological signals, our life events. And by reducing all that complexity down to just a chemical problem, the whole chemical imbalance idea, Ridge argues we're making a huge error in scope. We're missing the forest for the trees, or maybe even just looking at the chemical composition of one leaf.
That reminds me of the analogy he uses about the symphony. Can you explain that? It illustrates this reductionist error quite well, I thought.
Yeah, it's good. He says that reducing a complex human life story, with all its pain and meaning, down to just a functional problem of neurotransmitters. It's like claiming that the beauty, the harmony, the sheer genius of a Beethoven symphony depends only on the instruments being perfectly tuned and functional.
Okay.
Are the functional instruments necessary? Of course. You need the violins to be in tune, the trumpets to work. That's the biology, right? It has to function. But reducing the entire symphony, its emotional power, its structure, its meaning, down to only the functional state of the instruments. That ignores the composer's vision, the conductor's interpretation, the historical context it came from, the emotional journey it takes you on.
So we confuse the artwork with the tools used to create it.
Exactly. We confuse the complexity of the human life, the artwork, with the mere functionality of its tools, the neural circuits. We end up just polishing the tools, chemically speaking, without ever really engaging with the complex music, the narrative that those tools are supposed to be expressing.
But the defenders of the biomedical model would point to progress, wouldn't they? They'd say, look at the millions of people who have been helped by medications. Look at the new imaging techniques, fMRI, PET scans. Look at the genetic research, the potential of AI. Surely this focus on biology is leading to continuous improvement.
And this is where Ridge brings in what might be the most provocative, even devastating piece of data in his argument. He essentially argues that this perceived progress is largely an illusion.
An illusion? How?
It's an illusion built on technological advancement, not necessarily translating into better clinical effectiveness, where it matters most in long-term recovery and function. He cites some pretty critical literature here, including work by Ghaemi back in 2009, which basically concluded that despite all these spectacular technological leaps forward, amazing neuroimaging, genetic sequencing, AI is starting to come online. The fundamental clinical outcomes, the actual results for patients, and the basic treatment paradigms, they have remained virtually unchanged since the big psychopharmacological revolution back in the 1960s.
Wow. 60 years. Let's just pause on that for a second, because that claim that's huge. 60 years.
That's staggering.
We're talking about 3 full generations of psychiatrists, researchers, billions, probably trillions, poured into research and development globally. And Ridge is saying the actual ceiling on recovery, on getting people truly well, hasn't significantly lifted since the era of the first major psychiatric drugs.
That's the core of the charge. The 1960s, that was the big moment, right? With drugs like chlorpromazine, the early antidepressants, that was when psychiatry really promised it was becoming a true biological science that could offer cures. And the initial gains were revolutionary, no doubt. Managing acute psychosis, for instance, that was a massive step forward. But the stagnation Ridge and Ghaemi point to relates more to the chronic side of things, managing illness long-term and achieving real functional recovery.
Meaning people actually getting back to full, thriving lives.
Exactly. Getting people from just symptom management, just surviving, to integrated health, to actually thriving. Things like relapse rates for major depression, they remain stubbornly high. We can often manage the acute crisis effectively, yes, but moving beyond that, helping people build resilient, meaningful lives off medication or with minimal long-term dependence. That's where the progress seems to have stalled.
So we have much fancier tools now. Better scanners, more precise drugs, maybe better diagnostic categories.
Right. Better tools for diagnosing maybe, and certainly for administering treatments.
But the end result, the patient's actual ability to reclaim a full, meaningful life in the long run, that hasn't fundamentally improved since, the Kennedy administration.
That is the staggering implication Ridge puts forward based on that analysis. Technological progress has not automatically equaled clinical improvement. Why? Because, he argues, the map itself is wrong. We're using these incredibly sophisticated 21st century instruments, but we're applying them based on a blueprint, an assumption about the isolated neural machine that's arguably centuries old and fundamentally insufficient. So Ridge concludes we're stuck in a kind of paradigmatic crisis. We spent 60 years perfecting the wiring, making the signals cleaner, adjusting the chemistry, but we haven't been rebuilding the house's foundation. We keep hoping the next new molecule or the next fancy algorithm will be the magic bullet. But maybe, he suggests, it can't be, because the problem itself is fundamentally anchored in things like meaning, connection, and existential context, things a purely chemical approach isn't even designed to see, let alone fix.
Okay, this really brings the whole theoretical argument down to earth, doesn't it? Right into the clinic, the consultation room. Because if a busy clinician is listening to this, they might be thinking, okay, interesting ideas, but in my 15-minute medication review slot, exploring deep existential issues, patient life stories, that just sounds like it wastes precious time. It reduces efficiency. We need to get the patient stable now. There's that real tension, isn't there? Efficiency versus this deeper integrated healing.
Right, and Ridge argues that very tension is actually a symptom, a product of the incomplete blueprint itself. It's a false dichotomy. Because when the map you're using doesn't even show the foundational problem, then the quick fix, the symptom management, naturally appears to be the only logical, efficient option. You treat what you can see on your limited map. He directly counters this idea that digging into meaning equals inefficiency by presenting that central case study in his essay, Marina's Journey.
Ah, yes, Marina.
She's the perfect illustration, really. The portrait of this successful, compliant patient who, by the standard metrics, is doing okay, but internally is just bankrupt.
Tell us about her again, because she really embodies both the success and the failure of the purely biomedical approach, doesn't she?
She really does. So Marina's 35, she's an executive. On paper, looking from the outside, she's got it all figured out. High salary, gets promotions, physically healthy. But she comes in with recurrent major depressive disorder. Over several years, she'd been through the standard protocols, tried 3 different classes of SSRIs, maybe some augmentation.
Only did they help? Symptomatically, yes, to a degree. Her energy levels maybe improved a bit. The really acute suicidal thoughts were gone, which is obviously crucial. But how did she feel? In her own words, like an empty shell.
Wow.
The symptoms were being managed, chemically suppressed perhaps, but her actual sense of self or personhood felt muffled, flattened. The treatment protocol was followed perfectly, ticked all the boxes, but the patient, the human being, remained fundamentally unwell deep down.
And the critical moment, the thing that really exposed the failure of the map in her case, it involved her cat, didn't it? Which sounds almost trivial at first glance, but it revealed so much.
It was such a sharp clinical observation. Marina had this cat, Milo, lived with her for 12 years, and Milo was, as she described him, really her last proper anchor of affection, of genuine warmth in her life.
Okay.
A month before she sees Ridge, Milo disappears. Gone. And when Ridge gently asks her about this loss, about how she felt, she gives this absolutely chilling clinical pearl. She says, I felt nothing. Just a large, clean hole where despair should have been. That's devastating. The problem wasn't that she was sad. It was the metaphysical incapacity to be sad.
Exactly. She couldn't even connect to that sensitive reality anymore. Her life's pain, her capacity for deep feeling had been so effectively chemically buffered, perhaps, that the very wire linking her consciousness to authentic, resonant emotional experience had just dissolved.
It wasn't ignorance, like she didn't know she should feel sad.
No, she knew logically,
Yeah.
but she'd lost the internal capacity to actually generate that feeling, that subjective experience of grief. Her soul, if you use Ridge's term, that inner field of meaning, connection, virtues, desires, it had reached such a point of profound exhaustion, of disconnection, that even a loss this significant couldn't provoke an integrated human response. Her successful, high-functioning life had just become this series of empty actions, tasks efficiently processed, but nothing was genuinely felt.
And it was only when Ridge stepped off the standard symptom checklist map and started exploring her actual life narrative that he uncovered these dimensions that the prevailing blueprint just completely missed. Even though her drug treatment was, by its own standards, successful, we really need to look at these neglected dimensions because this illustrates the real human cost of using an incomplete map.
Absolutely. First, he found this neglected relational dimension, her childhood, marked by an emotionally unavailable, perhaps critical mother. This created an early template of emotional distance, of needing to be self-reliant, which is carried straight into her adult relationships.
Okay.
Second, the ignored bonding dimension. Her marriage looked fine from the outside. functional on paper, but inside it, she felt profoundly unseen, invisible, never truly validated or emotionally met by her partner. Third, this unmapped sociocultural dimension. Her work environment, this high-pressure executive world, it demanded constant peak performance, ruthless efficiency, and the systematic suppression of any vulnerability. She was essentially rewarded for acting like a machine, not a feeling human being.
And then the final piece, the real vacuum at the core of Ridge's argument for her. This non-existent, existential spiritual dimension, just the complete lack of a solid answer to that deep, haunting question. What is all this effort for?
Yes. And that vacuum, that lack of meaning and purpose, that was the crumbling foundation. All those other pressures, the distant mother, the invisible marriage, the demanding career they had just eroded her internal structure over years. They left her without a coherent sense of self, without purpose. She was, as Ridge put it, using that old wisdom, the living embodiment of the body screams what the soul silences. For her depression, her anxiety. Those were the screams of her body, the biological manifestations. But by treating only those chemical symptoms, the screams, while completely ignoring the context, the source of the profound inner silence, her soul, her story, her lack of meaning, the treatment achieved symptom control, yes, but it never achieved coherence. It never helped her heal. True recovery, in Ridge's expanded vision, has to involve restoring that connection to sensitive reality, rebuilding coherence, finding meaning. It can't just be about symptom control forever. The clinical cost of the incomplete map is precisely that difference, the gap between mere survival and truly integrated living.
Okay, the critique feels pretty solid now. It's anchored in history, it has some neuroscientific backing from people like Damásio, and it's vividly illustrated by cases like Marina's. But we have to circle back to that main point of resistance, that friction. If we start seriously talking about incorporating soul, meaning the spiritual dimension, into clinical practice, aren't we just muddying the waters? Aren't we risking turning medicine back into philosophy, or even worse, some form of religion? This is a core anti-science charge against Ridge, isn't it?
It absolutely is the core charge, and Ridge is clearly very aware of it. He tackles it head on.
How does he maintain scientific credibility while pushing for this much broader scope?
He's adamant about this. The third vision, this integrated model he proposes, is not anti-science. If anything, he argues, it's a call for expanded scientific rigor. It's about developing a scientifically expanded humanism. He turns the accusation around, essentially. He argues that to deny the importance of the emotional and spiritual dimensions, especially in light of what neuroscience like Damásio's tells us about the integration of reason and emotion, well, that's actually unscientific.
How so?
Because it means ignoring available evidence. If the science itself shows that the mind isn't just a detached, neutral machine, then clinging to a clinical blueprint based on that outdated neutral machine idea isn't scientific fidelity. It's actually intellectual inertia, a failure to update our models based on new knowledge.
Okay, so his goal isn't to replace science, but to make the scientific picture bigger, more complete, by integrating all the relevant data, even the subjective non-chemical stuff, into one coherent framework.
Exactly. Integrate, don't ignore. And he points out, he's not some lone voice crying in the wilderness here. He actually cites contemporary scientific and clinical literature showing that this kind of pushback against pure reductionism is already happening within mainstream thought.
Right. You mentioned some names earlier.
Yes, he mentions people like Bolton, arguing in just the last couple of years for an urgent need to revitalize the classic biopsychosocial model. Biology, psychology, social context, which Ridge feels has been kind of neglected in favor of the purely biological focus recently. But he even points beyond that to thinkers like Ongaro, who are advocating for something even broader, like an externalist psychiatry. This is the idea that the mind isn't just contained within the skull. It actually extends out into the world through our interactions, our relationships, our environment, our culture.
Wow, that's a big concept.
It is. But the point is, these are serious scientists and clinicians arguing from within the field that the purely isolated, brain-only biomedical model just isn't sufficient anymore. They're calling for integration, not for abandoning science.
Okay, but integration sounds complex.
Yeah.
If clinicians start adopting this much broader approach, does that mean they have to somehow ditch the essential biological understanding? Do we stop researching neurotransmitters? Do we throw out medications? Is Ridge setting up an either situation?
No, and that's absolutely crucial. He argues that's the fundamental false dichotomy that the old model forces us into. The third vision, this new integrated approach, absolutely keeps biology.
Okay.
It fully acknowledges that neurotransmitters are real, brain circuits are real, genetics matter. These things are relevant and often need to be addressed, sometimes pharmacologically. But biology isn't the whole story. The demand is for integration.
Yeah.
We need to place that biological understanding within a much more comprehensive framework, what's often called the biopsychosocio-spiritual model.
Right. Biopsychosocio-spiritual.
Exactly. In this model, you see biology as maybe the necessary foundation, the hardware. Psychology is like the operating system, how we process information and emotion. The social context, our relationships, culture, work, that's like the stabilizing structure around us, or sometimes the source of stress. And then the spiritual or existential dimension. That's like the coherence engine. It's about purpose, meaning, values, connection. Ridge argues you simply cannot fix just one part of that interconnected system in isolation and expects the whole thing to become healthy and function sustainably over the long term.
So let's nail down that definition of the spiritual dimension one last time, just to be crystal clear in this integrated context.
Right. Within this biopsychosocio-spiritual model, the spiritual dimension isn't about supernatural beliefs. It's the sum total of those deep inner processes that determine our sense of purpose, meaning, and coherence. It's that internal territory we talked about, made up of our unresolved traumas, yes, but also our deepest desires, our core virtues, our emotional conflicts, all the things that ultimately shape how we experience our emotions, how we find meaning or don't, and how we understand our place in the world. When that dimension is fractured or neglected, Ridge argues, the whole system becomes incoherent, unstable. Even if on paper the brain chemistry looks balanced, it's not about believing in a specific deity. It's about the structural integrity and coherence of your own life's narrative, your inner world.
So the ultimate goal, the outcome Ridge is proposing, is that true integrated healing only really emerges when we stop seeing neural circuits and subjective consciousness as two separate things.
And start seeing them as one continuous, deeply interconnected system. He uses that simple analogy. A lamp isn't just the sum of its parts, the filament, the switch, the wires. It's also the light it produces, the purpose it serves in illuminating the room, its placement, its context. And Ridge insists really strongly that approaching people this way isn't some kind of vague mysticism slipping into the clinic. He believes it's actually more rigorous empirical science because it's grounded in the evidence that affirms human complexity. Healing, real healing, happens when we move beyond just trying to silence the chemical short circuits and start actively helping people rebuild the structural integrity, the coherence, the meaning within their entire inner house. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, walking through Ridge's critique definitely leaves you with this unavoidable feeling, I think, that the current model, for all its strengths, feels profoundly incomplete somehow. And yet, at the same time, you can absolutely understand the fear, the hesitation about losing that hard-won scientific ground, right? The ground medicine fought so hard to secure against centuries of magical thinking and outright quackery.
Absolutely. And Ridge offers a really helpful way to reframe that legitimate fear. He says, real science, healthy science, always grows by inclusion, not exclusion. It expands its view to incorporate new data, new perspectives. The real tragedy, he implies, isn't that doctors or researchers are malicious or intentionally ignoring things. It's that they, like all of us, can get trapped in intellectually outdated models. The persistence in trying to build higher and higher on what might be a fundamentally flawed or incomplete foundation, especially when evidence from neuroscience itself is pointing to the cracks. That's the core issue Ridge is highlighting. It's about the failure to update our foundational assumptions.
So ultimately, the simplest answer to his own question, why do we treat pain without hearing the soul? It really comes down to a kind of epistemological inertia, a resistance to changing the map.
Precisely. We're working from an incomplete blueprint. We've been trained, the system is set up to follow a map that's very good at teaching us how to locate and chemically silence certain short circuits. But that same map has inadvertently made us blind, or at least nearsighted, to the deeper structural cracks, the existential foundations of human experience. We treat the pain without hearing the soul because in the dominant model we've inherited, the soul, this complex dimension of meaning, connection, trauma, desire, essence, it hasn't been considered a legitimate scientifically addressable variable in the equation of care. We're using, as he puts it, a clinical blueprint that meticulously maps the neural circuits, but completely ignores the organic, living, dynamic map of human feeling itself, the landscape where those circuits actually operate and derive their meaning.
We've talked about Marina's journey, and it really does serve as this powerful, maybe uncomfortable mirror. And the essay's final challenge really is for us to turn that mirror towards ourselves, towards the people around us. It asks you, the listener, how many Marinas have you encountered in your life? People who look successful, functional on the outside, but seem inwardly hollowed out. Or perhaps it asks, are you fighting some version of that battle yourself?
And accepting this incomplete model, settling for just symptom management when deeper coherence is possible. Rich suggests this carries a profound consequence. Looking at this pattern of stagnation, this potential for missed healing, he concluded one of his reflections with this rather stark thought, quoting from his notes. The worst doctor is the one who ignores the science he does not know. The worst patient is the one who settles for treatment that does not cure.
That's a heavy thought. So the diagnosis of the problem, the critique of the old model, feels quite complete based on his essay. But the absolutely essential next step, the one Ridge clearly sets up for his ongoing work, has to be about building that positive vision, right? The discussion has to shift now from just pointing out why the old blueprint is failing to exploring what might actually be sprouting in the cracks of the seemingly exhausted model.
Exactly.
Ridge is basically arguing that this missing spiritual dimension, understood in his grounded, humanistic way, isn't some kind of philosophical add-on or luxury. He thinks it's actually the key to unlocking both genuine, lasting patient healing and restoring a deeper scientific coherence to psychiatry itself.
And that, I suppose, is the really provocative thought we should leave you with today. If the failures and stagnation of the past 60 years strongly suggest that the mind and its suffering cannot be neatly confined to the skull and its chemistry, then what truly astonishing insights, what potential for healing are we currently missing, simply because we've been hesitant to look beyond the walls of the purely neurochemical laboratory? What happens when we start using a more complete map?